We have been horrified by stories of sexual abuse by clergy within the context of the church. Everything has changed around us, and we live in a different and a very strange world. We live in a world where a guy called Jimmy Wales has invented Wikipedia, with the great goal of taking all the collected knowledge of humankind and making it accessible to every person in the world. So now, what do we do with the story of a reanimated cadaver coming up from the grave? And is it any wonder that the world rejects much of what the church has to say? In Canada today, 85% of the population say that they are deeply spiritual, but only 17% attend church regularly. And so Canadian society today gives a resounding no to this question. Do you need the God of the church? No, they say, we do not. That God doesn't make sense to us and is not relevant to us. What are we going to do? Well, firstly, we say, whose fault is it that the world rejects God as the church presents God? Well, in some small part, it's the world's fault. They haven't come in here to hear what we're saying recently. But we can't fix that. It is also in part our fault, because we have truly presented a God which does not make sense to anyone. We have presented a false and foolish God, a superficial God, a plastic God, a pre-modern God that just barely made sense 2,000 years ago, who certainly doesn't make any sense to people in society today. Let me give you a couple of little examples of how we wittingly or unwittingly present this false God to the world. Sometimes on television you will see a news story. I think I've used this illustration before of a horrific bus accident in which many people of all ages, including little children, were killed or badly hurt. But one man survives that crash, and when he's being interviewed on the news, he looks into the cameras and he says, I guess the big guy upstairs was looking out for me. I pray every day that God will protect me, and I guess this proves that prayer works. How can you say something as unintelligent and cruel as that in the midst of tragedy? And yet how many of us, when we receive a blessing in the midst of suffering people, say the exact same thing, perhaps to a lesser degree, but we still say it, wow, look what God has done for me, while so many others are suffering. Do you really think that God is that God living up in the third tier of heaven who occasionally and arbitrarily reaches down and decides to bless one person or another while allowing others to suffer? Is that how God comes into the world? No, it is not like that. And that is not the God who is the God of the Bible or the true God. Sometimes when we look out into the world and see a tragic situation, such as the fact that every day 30,000 children die of hunger. It will happen today and tomorrow and the next day, and sometimes we as Christians say our prayers and we say, oh Lord, I wish that you would feed those children. What kind of a prayer is that? Is that what compassion is? We've been seeing the death of those 30,000 children for the last 40 years, and so far God has not rained food down upon them. Whatever that God is dead or never existed. If those children are going to be fed, it is because a risen Christ is going to live within inside of you and give you compassion so that you share and care for those who are suffering. But we still present that God that we think is going to reach down from heaven and help this or that person. Sometimes when we accomplish something great, we thank God. And it looks good, but is it really? When you see an actor holding up their Academy Award and they say, "I'd like to thank my mom and dad and my producer and my fellow cast members, and I would like to thank Jesus." Do you really think that Jesus cares who wins an Academy Award? And yet we do the same thing. We make God trivial. When we are winners, when we get something good, we say, "Look, God has blessed me." That is a corrupted God, a pre-modern God, a God who doesn't make sense to anybody in the whole world. When we go to war, we say, "God is on our side." God has no side. When we see sinners, we say, "Well, we're awfully glad that we are righteous." And in all of those things, we misrepresent God. We demean God. And it's no wonder 85% of Canadians are spiritual, but only 17% come to church. If that's the God we have portrayed, no wonder they're not here. So who is this God? I mean, who is this plastic, false, superficial God living up in heaven who reaches down now and then to bless the select few? Which God is that? Is it the God of the Old Testament? Were those Old Testament people shallow and misinformed about God? It's not the Old Testament God. There may be places in the Old Testament where God appears to act like that, but if you go to the latter passages in the Old Testament, you find that the themes of love and mercy and grace are fully revealed in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Hosea. Is it a pre-modern God? Even I use that term sometimes. Is it the God who existed before science? No, it's not even that. Because even in the oldest records that we have, pre-modern records, we see people with a faith that is rich and legitimate and full. It is simply the God of powerful people who never stopped to think out their theology very carefully. And so they said, "Look at us. We are powerful and rich and healthy because God has blessed us." And they didn't realize that that also meant that those people over there are weak and sick and poor because God has cursed them and is punishing them. This God that pops up so frequently, this fake God, is just the God of people who happen to be powerful and in that moment make the mistake of thinking everything is right with me because God has blessed me for my righteousness. That is no God whatsoever. It certainly is not the true God of the Bible. When Jesus came into this world, he showed us truly what God is. By going to the weak, shunning the powerful, going to the broken and the poor and the outcast and the sinner, and opening up his arms and saying, "I am with you and I am for you."